Good morning. Thank you. So I hope you are feeling at home this morning. I wasn't actually meant to be preaching this Sunday, so in my mind it's a bit premature, but after Pastor John's sermon a few weeks ago on the time, maybe the time is actually right, because a lot of the Bible verses that came to me are actually from Matthew, which fits in quite nicely with Deb's current series on the Gospels of Matthew. So I hope you have started reading it, or maybe this sermon will inspire you to go a bit deeper. Have we got any slides? So the title of today's sermon is To Build a Home. And the question, which home are you investing in? I'm going to use 3 key passages. The first is, the Son of Man has no place to rest his head. The second is, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And finally, in my Father's house are many rooms. But I'll start with this on the next slide. This is a picture of one of my husband Steve's many dreams homes. It is way out of budget, has a nice big garage, lots of land somewhere, and in the middle of nowhere. He says it's somewhere he might be able to breathe. Not that he can't breathe, but this is his dream home. He regularly sends me these kind of links on WhatsApp because he has this idea that life can be improved somehow by moving somewhere bigger and better. Unfortunately, he has the aspirations of a millionaire, but he's trapped in a pauper's body. What he'd really like to do is build his own home, but we don't have the finance for that. But we all dream of a better earthly life sometimes, don't we? When I was little, I used to play Barbies and live out an imaginary dream life there too. And I remember spending weeks designing my own home as a child. I'd cut out pictures out of catalogues, if you can remember what a catalogue is, because you don't just scroll through them. And I used to stick all these pictures in a little folder alongside my own drawings. But what I designed was pretty much just a 3-bedroom semi, which is pretty much the house that we live in now. So you could say I'm living my dream. I mean, I am quite happy living here in Womben, and I have said I am never moving again. Because have you ever actually moved house? We moved to Womben over 2 years ago, and I still haven't quite recovered from the experience of packing everything up, unpacking it, and then this endless task of still having to renovate a house with 3 kids running around and all the furniture in its place. Because it's shocking the amount of stuff that actually comes out of a house, isn't it? Even after you've got rid of all the basic clutter. I saw a quote recently that said, when you have to buy stuff to store your stuff in, it probably means that you have too much stuff. And it's true, isn't it? The bigger the house, the more stuff you just have to buy to fill the space. So then you just have to buy more stuff to clean, have bigger rooms to decorate, and then have more land to maintain. Bigger isn't always better like we imagine or dream of. Sometimes you might as well just clear out a smaller space. Anyway, we bought and moved into the house next door to my mum to look after her. But when she sadly passed away, she left us another house, and it was literally full of stuff. More stuff in the middle picture that I had to sort through. The middle picture is just one of the rooms. You see, she liked to keep stuff as her security. It was also a kind of mental health symptom of financial insecurity. But she didn't just hoard worthless items, she also treasured up all of our childhood toys. And I've recently spent the last few months decluttering it all from our garage. So in the 2 pictures either side, I've got all my Barbies and beanies, which she thought I might one day like to pass on to my children. Unfortunately, I have 3 boys, and they're not so keen on any of this inheritance. So I'm clearing out all this stuff, only to buy more stuff, but boy stuff. And after Christmas, I was thinking we just seem to acquire lots and lots more things, don't we, that we don't necessarily need. We think that if the kids don't have enough presents to rip their way through, to rip open in seconds on Christmas morning, that they're missing out on something. But no matter how much we spend on our kids or how big the house is, it's never, ever enough, is it? There's always someone with something more. There's something bigger, there's something better out there in the consumerist world. The only thing that fills the gaping hole in our lives is Jesus, isn't it? And so, as we find ourselves searching for bigger and better earthly things and things to fill them, how about we search for Jesus instead and what he's calling us to do and where he's calling us to go? So we know that the real gift of Christmas was Jesus himself, that he was heaven sent and that he has returned to heaven. But what about his home whilst he was on earth? In what kind of a house could he be found? Not in a castle or a palace, as Alan Hewitt reminded us in his sermon before Christmas, but the King of Kings was found in a feeding trough in a stable, which got me thinking about Jesus' home as he grew up. We know Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and the Gospels agree that his hometown as a child was in Nazareth, in Galilee, modern-day Israel. And back in 2020, archaeologists think they might have actually uncovered Jesus' earthly home, carved out of rock in a natural cave beneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent. Professor Dark, who found it, said, "Whoever built the house had an excellent knowledge of stoneworking, the sort of thing expected of someone who had been called a tekton. Tekton is the ancient Greek word for carpenter that was often used to refer to Joseph in the Bible. And in Matthew 13:55 it says, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary, and aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon and Judas?" You see, the word tekton here can also refer to other craftsmen, such as builders or artisans. Joseph was a carpenter, so it is likely that Jesus learnt the trade from his father. And the archaeologists said that whilst all these factors don't prove this was Jesus' home, it's about as close as we will probably ever get to being able to say it was. Perhaps then, Jesus was a builder himself. Perhaps this was his childhood home. However, he didn't just stick to the family trade. Most of his ministry was carried out in Galilee and Judea. On the next slide, on a map, just above and below Nazareth and Bethlehem. Notice that this area, though, covers a similar area to the route that Mary and Joseph would have travelled in the Christmas story. You see, Jesus never strayed too far from his hometown. But for the entirety of his ministry, he had no fixed abode. He was actually homeless, and his home was transient. He made his home with his disciples and the people who took him in different towns and villages, which was anywhere anyone would give him a pillow, basically, a bit like at his birth when there was no room at the inn, and they had to opt for a stable instead. Jesus himself was essentially poor. He had no wealth like earthly kings. In earthly terms, he had nothing, but spiritually, he had everything. And he spent his life throughout the Gospels giving away everything he had and more. But because he was poor, he often hung out with poor people. But we don't really do that enough, do we? I've just started a PhD actually in September, and next year I'm going to be based at Provision House, run by our very own Mark Price, who I can't see this morning. And there I'm going to be researching the ways that poverty is being alleviated and listening to other people's stories about where they've come from and where they're going to understand their perspective. Because at some point in our life, we could just as easily end up in poverty too. We could lose our job. There could be another credit crash. Or God could literally just take everything we have like he did to Job. But when Jesus sent out his disciples in Matthew 10, he said, "Do not take anything. Do not take any gold or silver or copper with you in your belts, no bag for the journey, or extra shirt, or sandals, or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep." So what about us? Should we sell all we have and give it to the poor? We heard of people remortgaging their own houses to pay for this church building last year in the Generation series. But not everyone is called to live in poverty or forsake their family and friends. After all, some of Jesus' followers were actually wealthy. However, we should be at least ready to forsake everything if Jesus asks or calls. We should be willing to lose it all and give it up. Essentially, we need to count the cost of following Jesus, just like in the key passage in Matthew 8, verses 18 to 22. It says, "When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a scribe, or a teacher of the law, came to him and said, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.' Jesus replied, 'Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head.' Another disciple said to him, 'Lord, first let me go and bury my father.' But Jesus told him, 'Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead.'" And I spent ages rereading this passage because verse 20 seems to make no sense, the verse underlined, as a reply to someone saying, "I want to follow you, Jesus." Imagine saying, "I want to follow you," and Jesus says, "I'm homeless, don't you know? I've got nowhere to sleep." Do you still want to follow Jesus? What he's saying is that following him is not always easy, and there are not always earthly rewards or security or houses in doing so. According to one commentary, Jesus here is painting himself in a very lowly position, desiring a resting place like one of the meanest creatures, the fox. Such creatures, though, are still well provided for by God. They have homes, they have dens, Similarly, the birds of the nest are sheltered, and they trust in God for their necessities, in contrast to the extreme poverty Jesus is experiencing. For our sake, he became poor. He had no settlement, no house, no pillow. He relied on the charity of others. The scripture speaks of him being poor and needy, maybe to shine a light on the vanity of our own worldly wealth. The person asking to follow Jesus in this scene, however, is a scribe or a teacher of the law. You might have expected to be quite helpful on the road in terms of writing things down and documenting Jesus' life. But Jesus doesn't offer an invitation to come follow him. Why? Maybe because this scribe's resolve is quite sudden and rash, like he's not fully counted the cost of following Jesus. Perhaps his intentions are slightly selfish in that he's seen Jesus performing miracles and perhaps he thinks he can get rich quickly by following him. But Christ quickly tells him he's not rich. Do not expect any worldly advantage. The second candidate for ministry in this scene is less confident, and in verse 21 it says he's already a disciple. The problem here is not being too hasty in making a decision for Christ, but being too slow in a resolution. Many are hindered in their faith by an over-concern for their families when Christ should come first, so we postpone our duty to God. Jesus' reply to this follower, though, is follow me. And he did, whereas the scribe left him. The point of this comparison is to show us that we're brought to Christ through his call. He calls us. Though some make excuses when Christ calls, the excuses can be overcome. Christ requires us to make him the priority over our parents, over our families, over our homes, when placed in a direct competition. Because Christ has an employment and a calling for us to do, which we can't always defer. Like Pastor John says, sometimes the time to follow is now. This account is also actually repeated in Luke, so it must be of some importance. And what the passage does is on the next slide. It conveys a sense of homelessness, a lack of worldly security. It reflects Jesus' total dedication to his mission, prioritizing the spiritual over the material. In the same way, I want to suggest we should focus on our spiritual home and not just our material home. Now, the most obvious passage to have used for this sermon would have been the building of a house of the wise man who built his house upon the rock rather than the sand, which is also in Matthew. Or I could have looked at church as a home, like Deb did last year in the home series. But this morning I really felt like I wanted to look at this contrast between physical worldly homes and the spiritual home that we're building, and to pose the question, where do your priorities lie? Just like Pastor Gail said 2 weeks ago, when she put out a challenge asking if we'd prioritize God over other things, over our families, over our homes this year. Where is your security? Is it in your home, in your financial position, or is it in God? And we all know that there's a difference between a house and a home. A house is the physical bricks and mortar of a building, whereas a home has this emotional, a relational, a spiritual dimension. A home is what makes a place feel personal. It's a safe place, a refuge, a place of belonging, somewhere you can leave in the morning and return to at night. It's familiar. And we make that home through our memories, our experiences with other people, often with our family and friends. But home doesn't have to be a house. It could be a cave, a tent, a flat, a boat, a caravan, a house you rent. But home has this personal and emotional meaning attached, rather than just the physical structure of the house, even though it's the bricks and mortar that cost the money. Home is a big deal. It's not about just about where we come from, though. It's about where we're going. And it's very comfortable. It's very easy to get comfortable in this life. We all have familial homes that we come from, and ancestry, like Deb said a couple of weeks ago. Some of us are lucky enough to inherit homes off our family, of our relatives. Others are left with debts to pay at the end of a loved one's life. But either way, we don't take our assets with us when we die. We spend a lot of time in our homes. We spend a lot of money maintaining them, extending them, refurbishing them. And then we spend a lot of time living in them, maybe moving home, working our way up the postcode hierarchy perhaps, all before we maybe get moved on into a care home, where you can only take a few possessions. Or if you're lucky enough to stay at home, you still have to sort out your will and decide who will inherit your home. You see, we can invest all we want in this earthly home, but it isn't actually ours to keep when we're gone. Even our children are only here for us to look after temporarily. They belong to God too. Often we don't even own the house we live in until we're into retirement because the bank owns most of it on a mortgage. Last time I talked about the story of Job and how he went from riches to rags, basically because God took everything, and he can. God can take everything if he wants. There's a popular song by Benson Boone, released exactly a year ago, actually, and it's called Beautiful Things. It's often on the radio whilst I'm driving to university. And the lyrics of that song say, I thank God every day for the girl he sent my way, but I know the things he gives, he can take away. Oh God, don't take these beautiful things that I've got. It's actually about a relationship rather than a physical house, but the principle is the same. God can take away our family, health, finances, just as Job found out all too literally. The conclusion I came to in that sermon, though, was that God created everything and therefore he was in full control. So he can give, he can take away, he could restore doublefold for reasons totally beyond our comprehension, but ultimately he sustains us. So we don't need to hoard and store riches here because God gives us everything we need. And everything is actually his because he created it. I recently came across this painting on the next slide by Joseph Turner. It was being displayed at Weston Park, and it's called Cicero at his Villa in Tusculum. And the curator that was there, he was describing how it actually depicts Cicero, if you can see him with another person at the bottom of the picture, showing off his vast estate. He's raising his arms, demonstrating how all this is his, which I thought was in complete contrast to what God says about land being his. So he's there showing off his wealth to his friend or whatever. But we can't buy our way into heaven or earn a place through earthly riches. We have to enter through a narrow gate. And if you look closely at the picture, it's open to interpretation, isn't it? I think there is like a little light down on the left between the trees with a little light at the end. In Matthew 7, Jesus says, enter through the narrow gates, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, but only few find it. My granddad had some pretty good property advice, and one of his mottos was always, invest your money in bricks and mortar, which is pretty sound advice most of the time, unless you buy at the wrong time, and there's a housing market crash, of course. But I did follow his advice a lot throughout my life for financial stability. But the danger with money and building a home here is that it can become an idol. So in Matthew 6, verses 20 to 24, on the next slide, it says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's saying you can see what people value most by where they put their money. Maybe in gold, maybe in property, fashion, lavish holidays, parties, supercars. Other people give vast amounts of their money and wealth to charity or medical research or science. But what we value and invest in reveals our heart. So my third and final question this morning is, where's your heart? I spent years wishing to leave my childhood home in Bolton. I couldn't wait to get out of there and fly the nest because my mum was a hoarder, as I shared earlier, which drove me mad because, like I said in a previous sermon, I had OCD and I loved everything to be clean and tidy. We were like chalk and cheese, and for me, home with Mum was not where my heart was. So when I turned 18, I was out of there like a shot. I went to university in Durham, and at that point, my mum moved back here to Womben, to her own childhood home with her mum. I then moved house a lot as a student, which is a lot easier than moving house with 3 kids in tow. But after that, we bought a house in Durham, where I settled with Steve for the next 8 years, and we started to fill our own family home. But what makes a house a home is actually the love in it. And when my mum got sick, I found that love was the bond that still bound us, and decided to move all my family to live in the house next door to her. So I came full circle. I left home with the full intention of living far away and never going back, to coming home and realising that I didn't need to run away anymore. Home wasn't about all the clutter and the stuff she filled the house with. Home was where the love was. Sometimes, though, we need to fly the childhood nest to learn some life lessons and understand where we've come from. The story of the Wizard of Oz is very similar. The main character in that, Dorothy, she runs away from home just as a tornado uproots her house, and she finds herself landing in a very strange place called Kansas. She's actually trapped in a dream world, somewhere over the rainbow. But she learns a few lessons along the way. She travels along a yellow brick road, as instructed, to try and find her way to the Emerald City, from where she's told she'll be able to go home. Along the path, though, there are a few fears she has to face: wicked witches, flying monkeys, all trying to throw her off her path. However, she makes 3 friends who help her to get back to where she belongs. There's a scarecrow with no brain, a tin man with no heart, and a lion with no bravery. They symbolize the respective need for wisdom, love, and courage. We all need wisdom, love, and courage of others on our journey too, don't we? We all need fellowship with family and friends to help us. And Dorothy was constantly helping people in need despite all of her own setbacks on the road. Unfortunately, there were struggles on our paths too, and we encountered trials and tribulations, but we need to remember this world is not our home. All along, Dorothy knows she doesn't belong in Oz, and all she wants to do is to get back home. The key phrase in the film is, "There's no place like home." And at the end of the movie, it's actually the ruby slippers that she's been wearing all along that have been with her. And it's a bit like God, isn't it? He's walking with us, always guiding our feet and our steps, but ultimately, he takes us home. I don't think The Wizard of Oz is actually a Christian story, but something about no place like home resonated. So where have we come from and where are we going? Sometimes we're a bit like Dorothy in relation to God and try to run away. But if he calls us, like the call in the first passage, then he's also reserved a place for us. In John 14 it says, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way to the place I am going." But in the chapter leading up to this, in John 13, Jesus predicts Jesus' denial, and it says, Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." But Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? Very truly, I tell you, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And I was thinking about it, and it's almost a reflection of the scene in Matthew 8 that we started with, where Jesus warns of the cost of following him. Because we've got Peter here begging to follow Jesus into heaven, promising to die for him. But Jesus tells him he doesn't actually have what it takes to lay down his life for him. He says, "You will deny me 3 times." And he does. I'm not going to speculate if Peter goes to heaven or anything, but I repeat, have we got what it takes to follow Jesus? The instruction is, you know the way to heaven, and the way is to follow me. How do you get from heaven to earth? You have to follow him. Sometimes, though, we have to understand where we come from in order to understand where we're going. We're here in our earthly homes of whatever sort and on a journey to a new home. Yes, we will have to move house again because we're part of God's plan to have us abide with him forever. So the question this morning is, are you too focused on your earthly home at the moment? Are your dreams rooted in earthly belongings or on storing up treasures for your heavenly home? Do you need to look up and focus more on investing in your eternal home before moving day creeps up? Where do your priorities lie? We need to make sure that we've counted the cost of following Jesus so we don't end up like Peter. And I'll end with this. Have you ever watched Grand Designs? You see, Steve really loves Grand Designs because there's lots of big houses involved. And they basically film and document people building their own grand houses. A majority of the time, they go way over budget. The building costs a lot of money, time and effort. But 99% of the time, once they've started, they have to finish it, no matter what the debt or the cost, because they feel like they have to fulfill their dream at all costs. So I want to ask, are you following Jesus at all costs this year? So I'll leave us with a couple of practical steps, perhaps, for the week ahead. Maybe let's symbolically, literally, get rid of some stuff this year. Stuff that's holding us back, stuff that gets in the way of Jesus' calling to follow me. Maybe we should do a good deed or something you think God is prompting you to do. Maybe it's visiting someone or just giving someone you know some time or something you know that they're in need of. Invest in your heavenly home, in spiritual rather than financial riches. Because remember, if he's called you, he has a place for you. Or maybe he's whispering an invitation to you this morning, are you coming home? Will you follow me? And if that's you, don't miss it or make an excuse like the disciple did regarding burying his father. Come and pray with someone at the front at the end during the final song. Thank you.